There comes a moment in life when the familiar self, the identity you have clung to, begins to tremble. It is subtle at first, a whisper of doubt, a fleeting discomfort, a question that arises unbidden. And yet this moment is profound. The instant you witness your own reflection in a deeper truth, the walls of your old self start to fracture. The self you have built, the one that conforms, that seeks approval, that fears the unknown, cannot endure this encounter. It was never designed to house the fullness of your being. And as these structures crumble, something essential begins to emerge, an awareness of the vast inner landscape that has always existed beneath the surface. This is not a moment of loss, it is a moment of awakening. Shadows you have ignored, patterns you have denied, fears you have buried. They rise now, not to harm you, but to guide you. To collapse is not to vanish, it is to shed the weight that has kept you bound. Through this collapse you encounter your raw, unfiltered essence, a self untouched by the expectations of the world, unshackled from old stories, ready to step into authenticity. Transformation is rarely gentle. It comes in flashes, in moments of discomfort, in the silent recognition that what once defined you no longer fits. But within this collapse lies freedom. You begin to see life not as a chain of obligations and inherited patterns, but as a living dialogue between your inner truth and the world around you. You realize that every loss, every fear, every ending has been a call to this very emergence, the emergence of a self that is unafraid, awake, and whole. The old self collapses so that the true self can rise. And in that rise, you touch the mystery of your own potential, the infinite capacity of being, and the beauty of a life lived in alignment with your deepest knowing. The moment you witness this, you are reborn, not as someone new, but as someone who has remembered who they always were. And that is the beginning of true freedom. The recognition of collapse is rarely sudden or dramatic. It is often a quiet, almost imperceptible shift within the depths of our being. It begins with a subtle awareness, a fleeting sense that the foundations we have built our identity upon are no longer solid. The old self, the one we have nurtured and protected for years, perhaps decades, was constructed to navigate the world in ways that felt safe, familiar, and acceptable. It was a self carefully honed to meet expectations, to maintain appearances, to avoid discomfort. And yet, no matter how intricate or secure it seemed, it was never the totality of who we are. The deeper truth of our being cannot be contained within such rigid structures, and eventually, the confrontation with these truths begins to erode what we once called ourselves. This moment of recognition is both unsettling and illuminating. It often arises in unexpected circumstances, a sudden loss, a confrontation with failure, the silent reflection of solitude, or even the disquieting experience of observing our own patterns from a distance. These moments act as mirrors, showing us the illusions we have been living under, the stories we have told ourselves to justify comfort, and the fears we have hidden from view. When the veil is lifted even slightly, the old self cannot remain intact. It trembles because it has never been designed to encompass the totality of existence. The vast, complex, often contradictory layers of thought, feeling, instinct, and desire that define the human psyche. The fracturing of the old self is rarely linear. There is no single event that demolishes it entirely. Instead, the collapse begins in fragments, in moments of dissonance that grow in intensity over time. You may notice it in small ways, a thought that no longer resonates, a habit that feels hollow, a relationship that exposes the superficiality of your previous self. Each fragment that falls away feels like loss, and yet, paradoxically, it is the very loss that carries the seeds of liberation. The old self clings to familiarity, but the deeper truth calls relentlessly. The confrontation between these forces, between the comfortable and the essential, is the crucible in which transformation begins. In recognizing this collapse, there is a profound invitation to witness the dissolution of identity without resistance, to see the fragility of self not as a threat but as an opening. Awareness itself becomes the key. When we can observe the fractures without panic, when we can allow the old self to crumble without clinging to remnants of who we were, we begin to experience the first glimmers of something more authentic. It is here, in the awareness of disintegration, that the self begins to transcend its limitations. The process is not instantaneous, nor is it painless. There is grief for what is lost, confusion in the void, and the disorienting sense that the ground beneath us has shifted. Yet every tremor, every crack, is a necessary step toward wholeness. The old self cannot hold the totality of our being. It was never meant to. Its collapse is not an end, but an essential clearing, a clearing that allows for the emergence of a self that is deeper, more integrated, and aligned with the unspoken truths that have always existed within. In this recognition, we touch the paradox of existence. The moment the old self begins to fracture is the same moment the possibility of authentic being begins to arise. To confront the deeper truths within ourselves is not merely to lose what we were. It is to become capable of embracing what we have always been, hidden beneath the layers of habit, fear, and conformity. The recognition of collapse is ultimately the threshold to awakening, the first step toward a self that is unafraid, expansive, and truly alive. Awakening through shadows is a journey that begins not in light, but in the quiet, often unsettling spaces within ourselves that we have long avoided. These shadows are not mere darkness or flaw. They are the parts of us that we deny, suppress, or fail to understand. The impulses, fears, and patterns that linger beneath the surface of conscious awareness. For much of our lives, we build identities that favor acceptance, safety, and predictability, masking the truths that might disrupt comfort or challenge the narratives we tell ourselves. Yet these hidden parts, these shadows, are far from inert. They hold wisdom, guidance, and the keys to a more authentic existence. The moment we begin to confront them, to allow them into the light of consciousness, an awakening begins. A subtle but profound transformation that steers us toward our true being. The shadows often emerge in unexpected ways. They appear through recurring patterns in our relationships, the repetition of habits that frustrate or harm us, or through emotions that seem disproportionate or confusing. Fear, anger, jealousy, or sorrow may surface suddenly, startling us because we thought we had mastered or dismissed them. Yet these feelings are not arbitrary. They are signals, markers pointing us toward the aspects of ourselves we have neglected. To awaken through shadows is to listen carefully, to allow these emotions to speak their truths, rather than turning away or forcing them into silence. In this act of listening, we begin to see that the shadow is not an enemy, but a teacher, a guide toward deeper self-understanding. Confronting shadows requires courage because it demands honesty with ourselves. We cannot awaken while clinging to the comfort of illusion. The shadow reveals contradictions within us, aspects we might feel ashamed of or wish to reject. It exposes fears of inadequacy, patterns of self-sabotage, and unacknowledged desires. To engage with these truths is to face the raw material of our inner world, to recognize that our consciousness is only one layer of our being, and that beneath it lies complexity, depth, and wisdom. In allowing the shadows to emerge, we enter a dialogue with ourselves that has the power to transform habitual reactions into conscious choice. This awakening is subtle yet powerful. It does not arrive as a sudden epiphany, but as a steady unfolding of insight. As we recognize the patterns and fears that have guided our actions unconsciously, we gain the ability to respond rather than react. Relationships, work, and life choices begin to shift, not because we impose change, but because the integration of shadow allows us to move with clarity and authenticity. What once caused inner conflict now becomes an opportunity for growth. What once triggered fear now becomes a doorway to understanding. The shadows, once feared or ignored, become allies, offering guidance toward wholeness rather than fragmentation. To awaken through shadows is also to embrace paradox. These hidden aspects of ourselves may seem threatening or undesirable, yet their emergence is essential for balance and self-realization. The darkness we resist contains the seeds of light, and by acknowledging it, we discover a deeper capacity for empathy, creativity, and self-compassion. We learn that authenticity is not the absence of imperfection, but the courage to embrace the entirety of our being, including the parts that have long been hidden. In the end, the awakening through shadows is a call to integration. It is a reminder that authenticity is forged not in avoidance, but in engagement with the whole self. As we allow our ignored patterns and fears to surface, we find guidance, direction, and ultimately freedom. Shadows are not obstacles to our growth. They are signposts, pointing the way toward a life lived with depth, honesty, and the courage to be fully ourselves. Through this awakening, we move closer to a self that is not fragmented or constrained, but alive, aware, and truly aligned with the essence of who we are. Freedom in discomfort is a paradox that few embrace willingly, and yet it is one of the most profound catalysts of transformation. For much of our lives, we are conditioned to seek comfort, to avoid pain, and to cling to routines that feel safe. Comfort provides the illusion of control, of stability, and of predictability, but it is rarely fertile ground for growth. True transformation arises not in the ease of the familiar, but in the tension, struggle, and uncertainty that accompany change. Discomfort, when faced with awareness, becomes a teacher, a doorway through which the old self must pass in order for something greater to emerge. Discomfort manifests in many forms. It can appear as the inner restlessness that pricks at the soul when we follow paths that no longer resonate, as the anxiety that accompanies confronting fears we have long ignored, or as the ache of letting go of habits and relationships that once defined us. These sensations are unsettling because they threaten the identity we have carefully constructed. They force us to question our patterns, our assumptions, and the very stories we have relied upon to navigate life. Yet within this tension lies opportunity. Discomfort signals the edges of our growth, the boundary where the old self resists the emergence of the new. It is in this space, fraught with uncertainty, that transformation quietly begins. Breaking old habits is central to this process. Habits are the scaffolding of the self, the behaviors, reactions, and mental loops that have shaped our lives for years. Some habits are practical, others comforting, and some are protective masks worn to shield us from pain or judgment. Yet no habit, no matter how familiar, can contain the totality of our being. When we encounter discomfort, it is often a sign that a habit has become a chain, binding us to patterns that no longer serve our evolution. The courage to confront these habits, to face the unease of dismantling what is familiar, is a profound act of liberation. Each time we resist the pull of the habitual and choose awareness, we carve space for freedom. Discomfort also strips away illusions. It exposes where we have settled, where we have avoided truth, and where our lives have been constrained by fear or expectation. In these moments, the mind may recoil, seeking distraction or rationalization. But if we allow ourselves to remain present with the discomfort, to witness it fully without fleeing, we begin to perceive its deeper purpose. It is a signal that our soul is pressing against limitations, urging us to expand beyond self-imposed boundaries. The very resistance that feels painful becomes the force that drives us toward authenticity. Transformation through discomfort is not a process of immediate reward. It is slow, deliberate, and often lonely. It requires a willingness to navigate uncertainty without the comfort of guarantees, to embrace feelings that are uncomfortable yet instructive. Yet the freedom that emerges is profound. It is the freedom of no longer being dictated by the old self, of no longer being imprisoned by habits, fears, or societal expectations. It is the freedom to live in alignment with the truth of one's own being, to act with clarity, and to move through life with intentionality rather than compulsion. Ultimately, freedom in discomfort teaches that suffering and growth are inseparable. The breaking of old habits, the confrontation with inner resistance, and the courage to dwell in unease are the crucible in which the authentic self is forged. Discomfort is not the enemy, it is the midwife of transformation, guiding the collapse of what is no longer viable and the emergence of a self that is alive, whole, and free. To embrace discomfort is to embrace life in its raw, unfiltered essence, and through this embrace, true freedom is realized. Shedding old stories is one of the most profound acts of self-liberation, yet it is also one of the most challenging. From the moment we are born, we are immersed in narratives, stories passed down through family, culture, and society. These narratives shape our beliefs, our behaviors, and even our sense of identity. They tell us who we are, what we should value, what we should fear, and how we are expected to live. For a long time, these inherited patterns may feel like the natural order of life, unquestionable and necessary for survival. Yet they are often constrictive, confining the true self to a script written long before we had the awareness to author our own lives. The moment we begin to recognize these stories for what they are, not truths, but inherited patterns, we open the door to authenticity. Letting go of old stories requires deep awareness and courage. These narratives are familiar and comforting. They provide a sense of belonging and structure. To question them is to risk uncertainty, isolation, and even resistance from the world around us. But the authentic self cannot fully emerge while bound by inherited expectations. The stories we carry act like a mask, a carefully constructed persona designed to meet the demands of others, often at the expense of our own desires, impulses, and intuition. When we begin to observe these stories, we start to notice the ways they limit us, the choices we make to please rather than express, the fears we inherit instead of confront, the patterns of thought that repeat unexamined across generations. The process of shedding these narratives is often uncomfortable. It can feel like losing part of oneself, because these stories have been deeply entwined with identity. There is grief in realizing that what we believe to be our own convictions may actually be echoes of someone else's expectations. There is fear in stepping into a world where our authentic voice must replace the familiar scripts we have relied upon. Yet it is precisely in this discomfort that transformation begins. Each story we release, each expectation we question, loosens the chains that have held the self in imitation rather than truth. As we let go of inherited patterns, we make space for our inner essence to breathe. The authentic self, which has always existed beneath layers of conditioning, begins to surface. We start to recognize our own desires, instincts, and intuitions, separate from the weight of obligation and inherited norms. This process is not about rejecting all wisdom of the past, but discerning which stories serve growth and which constrain it. In shedding what no longer serves us, we honor the intelligence of the self, the deep knowing that exists beyond learned behavior, beyond cultural scripting, and beyond fear of judgment. The liberation that comes from shedding old stories is profound. Life begins to feel less like a performance and more like an expression. Decisions are made not out of habit or expectation but out of alignment with the self. Creativity, joy, and vitality emerge as the self steps fully into its own rhythm, no longer contorted by the weight of inherited narratives. Relationships shift, work transforms, and even perception of the world changes, because the lens through which we experience life is no longer colored by the unexamined stories of the past. Ultimately, shedding old stories is an act of courage, clarity, and self-respect. It is a conscious refusal to be confined by inherited fears, outdated expectations, and societal pressures. Through this act, the authentic self is revealed, raw, vibrant, and whole. The old narratives collapse not as a loss, but as a liberation, creating a space in which the true self can emerge fully, unbound, and alive. The process is neither easy nor instantaneous, but it is essential for living a life that is real, unfiltered, and deeply aligned with the essence of who we are. The emergence of the true self is the moment when the fragments of collapse, the shadows we have faced, the discomfort we have endured, and the stories we have shed begin to coalesce into a coherent, authentic presence. It is not the creation of something entirely new, nor the invention of a self out of imagination. Rather, it is the unveiling of what has always existed beneath the layers of fear, expectation, and habit. Beyond the collapse of the old self, beyond the dismantling of conditioned patterns, a self aligned with inner truth begins to rise. A self that moves, perceives, and acts in harmony with the deep currents of being. This emergence is subtle at first, like the first stirrings of dawn after a long night. There may be fleeting moments of clarity, brief flashes of intuition, or sudden insights that seem to arrive without explanation. These are signs that the self is reconnecting with its own essence, tuning into a rhythm that is uniquely its own. Unlike the old self, which relied on comparison, approval, or conformity, the emerging self does not seek validation outside of itself. Its compass is internal, guided by an intimate knowing that transcends fear, judgment, and the limitations of inherited narratives. The rising of the true self is also accompanied by a profound sense of coherence. Whereas the old self was fragmented, caught between desires, expectations, and fears, the authentic self experiences a quiet unity. Thoughts, emotions, and actions begin to align, not through effort or force, but through the natural integration of all aspects of being. The self that emerges is aware of its shadows, compassionate toward its past struggles, and accepting of its imperfections, yet it is no longer defined or constrained by them. In this way, the emergence of the true self is not merely a personal evolution. It is a reconciliation, a harmonization of inner opposites into a living wholeness. This process also brings freedom. When the self rises from the ruins of old conditioning, it is liberated from the compulsions that once dictated behavior. No longer bound by fear, guilt, or obligation, the emerging self can act in alignment with its own principles and intuition. Decisions are made with clarity rather than habit, and actions flow from authenticity rather than from the need to perform or conform. Life itself begins to feel less like a struggle against constraints and more like a participation in an unfolding process in which each choice, encounter, and challenge is navigated with presence, integrity, and awareness. The emergence of the true self is transformative not only internally but externally as well. Relationships, work, creativity, and engagement with the world begin to shift, reflecting the alignment of the self with its inner truth. Interactions are no longer filtered through fear, neediness, or pretense, but arise from a grounded presence that attracts authenticity in return. The world itself becomes a mirror of the emerging self, revealing the harmony, clarity, and vitality that have begun to flourish within. Ultimately, the rise of the true self is a reminder that all the work of collapse, shadow integration, discomfort, and shedding has a purpose: to create the conditions in which authenticity can emerge. The true self does not replace what we were, nor does it negate the experiences we have lived. Instead, it integrates them, transforms them, and rises from them, fully aware, fully alive, and fully aligned with the deepest currents of being. To witness this emergence is to touch the profound truth that we have never been separate from ourselves, and that the journey of transformation is, at its heart, a return to the essence that has always been waiting, quietly and patiently, beneath the surface. Rebirth and a collapse brings disorientation and discomfort, but it also signals readiness, a readiness to step into a life of freedom, wholeness, and untapped potential. Freedom arises because the constraints of the past no longer bind us. The beliefs, habits, and expectations that once dictated our thoughts and actions lose their power as we awaken to our own authority. No longer held hostage by fear, judgment, or societal pressures, we move through life with clarity and intentionality. This freedom is not chaotic or unmoored. It is anchored in self-knowledge and presence. The self, liberated from external demands, can finally respond authentically, act decisively, and live in alignment with its deepest truth. Every choice, every action becomes an expression of inner integrity, rather than a reaction to the expectations of others. Wholeness emerges hand in hand with this freedom. The reborn self is not a fragment or a partial reflection, but an integration of all that we have experienced, including our shadows, failures, and moments of despair. The aspects of ourselves that we once denied or feared are acknowledged, understood, and woven into the tapestry of our being. This integration brings a sense of completeness. We are no longer divided between who we pretend to be and who we truly are. The rebirth does not erase the past, it transforms it, showing us that every challenge, every loss, and every fragment of the old self has contributed to the formation of a self that is rich, resilient, and whole. In this state of rebirth, the realization of untapped potential becomes palpable. As the old limitations fall away, new capacities for creativity, intuition, courage, and insight arise. Skills that were latent, desires that were suppressed, and possibilities that were previously invisible now come into view. Life itself becomes an unfolding canvas, responsive to our engagement, imagination, and will. The potential within us, long restrained by fear or habit, now has room to breathe, grow, and manifest. The rebirth is not a passive event. It is an active emergence, a coalescing of inner resources into a form capable of fully inhabiting the world with authenticity and purpose. Alignment completes this process. The self, freed from the constraints of old stories and patterns,